The 60s was an era for music, with popularization and the emergence of so many genres. Believe it or not, bands led this golden era of music. However, with the tinted glasses of 5 white decades separating us now, it's easy to forget just how controversial some of the biggest bands from the 60s were and how these shady controversies fueled and marred their growth. So, here are some of the most controversial bands from the 60s that we need back. Jefferson Airplane. If you don't remember the name, no one will blame you. The group's name fizzled out right after the start of the 70s. Formed in San Francisco, California in 1965, Jefferson Airplane was one of the pioneering psychedelic rock bands. Regardless of their success and influence on the 60s counterculture, Jefferson Airplane was embroiled in quite some controversies that, more than anything, reflect the era's cultural and social tensions. For starters, in 1968, right at the height of their fame, Grace Slick, the group's keyboardist, walked up on stage and performed in blackface, sparking major criticism over racial insensitivity. Barely a year after this, while performing at Almont Free Concert, organized by the Rolling Stones, who also had their fair share of controversies, an attendee, Meredith Hunter, was fatally stabbed by concert security. In addition to all this, which only fueled the group's fame, the group also raised eyebrows with their music, which often incorporated drug references. Their hit song, White Rabbit, was particularly controversial for its allusions to drug use. Rather shockingly, these still weren't the reasons for their decline at the turn of the decade. They eventually broke up in the 70s, so the name Jefferson Airplane isn't as big as it was touted to be. But very few bands perfectly reflect the turbulent spirit of the 60s for sure.
Just got home from Illinois, locked the front door, oh boy, got to sit down, take a rest.
Creedence Clearwater Revival. Many argue that the success of Jefferson Airplane was tied to the controversies it faced. The same can't be said for the next group on our list, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Unlike Jefferson Airplane, these guys don't need to be introduced. You can't talk about the influx of bands from the 60s through to the 70s without mentioning the name Creedence Clearwater Revival. Formed in El Cerrito, California, the group consisted of lead vocalist John Fogerty, his brother and rhythm guitarist Tom Fogerty, bassist Stu Cook, and drummer Doug Clifford. These 4 men would go on to shape the sound of the late 60s and well into the early 70s, producing 14 consecutive top 10 singles and 5 consecutive top 10 albums in the US between 1969 and 1971. The group disbanded just a year after this incredible run, and yes, it had everything to do with their many controversies. The controversies they faced didn't keep them relevant. No, it ruined them. John Fogerty, the lead vocalist, was the creative force in the group, and this, however unnecessary it may sound, led to tensions over royalties and credits. The other 3 members felt marginalized, as John was responsible for most aspects of their work. The other 3 members felt marginalized. John's brother eventually left the band in 1971, publicly citing frustration with his brother's dominance as his reason for doing so. Creedence Clearwater Revival remains influential past the 70s, but you have to wonder what could have been if this controversy hadn't destroyed them. The Who. Here's another band who, like Creedence, didn't need controversies to rule the 60s and 70s. A name everyone should be familiar with, The Who. The English rock band formed in 1964 has often been considered one of the most influential rock bands of the 20th century. Honestly, it's not hard to see why. The development of Marshall Stack, Entwistle's and Moon's iconic playing styles, Townshend's feedback, and power chord guitar technique, even right down to synthesizers. Rock and roll wouldn't be what it is today with The Who. But within all that, within their domination of the 60s and 70s, within their iconic careers, are more than a few controversies that will have you wondering why their name wasn't The Y instead. Most notably, their destructive behavior, particularly their drummer Keith Moon. Moon was infamous for his destructive stunts, including tearing hotel rooms apart, smashing drum kits, and even driving a car straight into a swimming pool. His antics even led to tensions within the group and their management. And here's the thing, while the band did have problems with his destructive behavior, they weren't far off either. The problem was Moon was still rocking and rolling well after the music was turned off. Sadly, their destructive and energetic live performances and even violence against the audience led to several incidents, including the famous concert in 1967 that saw Pete Townshend knock a police officer out. Well, speaking on Townshend, we had this whole child pornography scandal back in 2003. He was arrested and charged with accessing child porn online, even though he claimed all he was doing was researching a book on the matter. He was only cautioned and placed on the UK's sex offender registry. The Jimi Hendrix Experience. Next up is a band that wasn't together for too long but happened to shake the world, regardless with their music and their many controversies. The Jimi Hendrix Experience. Yeah, you may only remember the face of the group, Jimi Hendrix, and not the group itself. But if you lived through the 60s, then the Jimi Hendrix Experience definitely had you on your feet every single time. Formed in October 1966, the group, led by Jimi Hendrix, was only active for almost 3 years. The group had Hendrix as lead singer, songwriter, and guitarist, Noel Redding as bassist and backing vocalist, and Mitch Mitchell as the drummer. But Jimi Hendrix was always making front-page headlines for all the wrong reasons. In their 3 years together, they had 3 commercially successful studio albums. The group didn't need any controversies to stay relevant, but they came anyway, mostly because the era's resistance to innovations. The world found Hendrix's innovative guitar techniques revolutionary. It would often spark heated debates. His use of distortion, feedback, and stereo panning on songs like Are You Experienced created these auditory hallucinations. And the 60s didn't like that, considering it as unacceptable music. The 60s were a different era, and some of these controversies show just that. However, besides that, Hendrix had explosive stage performances, just like The Who, which featured the burning and smashing of guitars. The 60s also didn't like that at all. Hendrix was also arrested at Toronto International Airport in 1969 for possession of narcotics. He was later acquitted, but the damage had already been done. Hendrix was quite the character, and every problem the era had with the Jimi Hendrix Experience was because of him. No wonder the rest of the band members aren't as known. The Association. So far, rock bands have been on the wrong end of the 60s press. Well, there's a sunshine pop band that has faced its fair share of controversies. A band that was criticized for being too soft, if you'd believe that. Next up is The Association. Yet another pretty popular band who definitely didn't need controversies to rise or stay at the top. During the late 60s, The Association had some hits at or at least near the top of the Billboard charts, and was even the lead-off band at 1967's Monterey Pop Festival. Often consisting of 6 to 8 members, their thing was intricate vocal harmonies by multiple singers, with well over 15 different people going in and out of the group. However, that's not where the controversies came from. The group, right at the height of their fame, was accused of easy listening and being too soft, which led to accusations that they just weren't edgy enough for the 60s music scene. In addition to this, their 1966 song, Along Came Mary, was heavily criticized for its perceived reference to the use of marijuana. While we all get that in music these days, it was different back then, even to the point that the song was banned on several radio stations. The association was involved in numerous royalty disputes and lawsuits with Warner Brothers, their record label. This particularly was what destroyed the band from the inside out. Not the most controversial on our list, but they did raise a couple of eyebrows, even for a pop band.
Oh, I could hide.
The Monkees. You might not remember their music, but their TV series should jog your memories. Formed in LA in the 60s, the Monkees consisted of Mickey Dolenz, Davy Jones, Michael Nesmith, and Peter Tork. Spurred by the success of their TV series, the group became one of the most successful bands of the late 1960s, from a fictional band to becoming one of the biggest groups of their time. But as usual, they were embroiled in a couple of controversies, none too damaging. For starters, there were many pushbacks from the audiences who claimed they were specifically for a TV show. They were hated, with many people accusing them of not being a real band. As if this weren't damaging enough, the band didn't initially play their instruments. Instead, session musicians were used. Compared to other bands that played their instruments, the Monkees were slammed again for not being authentic. Later, Davy Jones, the group's heartthrob, often clashed with other members, feeling underutilized and overshadowed. They eventually disbanded because of personal tensions and creative control. Ultimately, they might be remembered more for their TV series than their music. MC5. Next up is a band that laughed at the mention of the word subtlety, a band that shook stages and the status quo, Detroit's MC5. With a classic lineup consisting of vocalist Rob Tyner, guitarist Wayne Kramer, and Fred Sonic Smith, bassist Michael Davis, and drummer Dennis Thompson, MC5 is often regarded as one of the best hard rock bands ever. They weaponized rock and roll and dominated the music scene well into the 70s. But it's their 1969 debut album that puts them on this list. Their debut album, Kick Out the Jams, opened with the yell, "Kick out the jams, mother f***." That kind of blatant profanity just wasn't for the time. Radio stations got it banned, and record stores refused to stock up on the album. A very, very different time indeed. Besides that, they weren't just singing about revolution, they lived it. Managed by White Panther Party co-founder John Sinclair, MC5 played protests and rallied against the Vietnam War. In fact, the FBI had them on a watch list. In 1968, they played for 8 hours straight outside the Democratic National Convention while police tear-gassed protesters nearby. MC5 lived their music, but inevitably burned way too fast, breaking up in 1972. The Osmonds. The association isn't the only pop group on our list. The Osmonds were an American family music group that climbed to the top in the early to mid-70s. The Osmonds had its most popular configuration as a quintet and a quartet. The group had been in the public eye since the 60s and consisted entirely of siblings who were all members of a family of musicians from Utah. The group's fame eventually dried out after the release of their 1975 album, The Proud One, which sold rather poorly. But before that, many people had a bone to pick with them, even though they were highly religious, which ironically was the audience's #1 problem with them. The Osmonds were a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and oftentimes their music was seen as a way to promote the church's values. Regardless, critics accused the group of using their music to persuade and recruit members to their church. In addition, even being a family couldn't save them from the tensions and conflicts within the group. To put simply, they hated each other's guts. Lastly, Marie Osmond, the only sister in the family, struggled with personal problems, including a major eating disorder that the media exploited ruthlessly.
It's just the wasted years so close.
The Velvet Underground. While the Osmonds were criticized for being too clean and religious, our next controversial band, the Velvet Underground, was panned for being too abrasive and dirty. Formed in New York City in 1964 and composed of singer and guitarist Lou Reed, multi-instrumentalist John Cale, guitarist Sterling Morrison, and drummer Angus MacLeese, the Velvet Underground was best known for its integration of rock and avant-garde, which earned it commercial success. They are known as one of the most influential bands in the underground, experimental and alternative music. In 2004, the Velvet Underground was ranked number 19 on the Rolling Stones list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. However, to get there, they raised many eyebrows in the 60s. Their nihilistic attitude, experimentation, and provocative attitude are the reasons they're highly revered, but it's also the reason why they were quite controversial. The group's music often featured explicit themes and lyrics, including prostitution and drug use. This led to a lot of controversies and censorship. Lou Reed, the group's lead singer, was also quite the smart mouth, which got him in feuds with other musicians like David Bowie, Patti Smith, and Iggy Pop. The Doors. If you go through the 60s to the 70s and even to the 80s, you probably won't find a band as controversial and yet as influential as The Doors. That's why they get our next spot. Comprising vocalist Jim Morrison, keyboardist Ray Manzarek, guitarist Robbie Krieger, and drummer Johnny Densmore, The Doors is widely regarded as the most important figure of the 60s counterculture. Dubbed the Kings of Acid Rock, the group was one of the most commercially successful bands of their time. And as of 1972, they'd already sold over 4 million albums domestically. And honestly, their many controversies were a major reason why. For starters, the group's lead singer, Jim Morrison, was known for his provocative and wildly unpredictable stage behavior, just like Jimi Hendrix or The Who. The only difference is Jim Morrison's might have been worse. He'd often do poetry readings, simulate sex acts, and even destroy property on stage. Most notably, in 1967, when The Doors appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, dear old Morrison refused to change the lyrics of Light My Fire, leading to controversies. In addition to all that, Morrison's substance abuse was well documented, and his behavior offstage led to concerns among band members. There was another incident in Miami in 1969 that saw Morrison get arrested for public drunkenness and open profanity. The incident led to this highly publicized trial and an eventual guilty verdict. Every major controversy that hung over the group's heads had the name Jim Morrison written all over it. The Jimi Hendrix of The Doors. It was this way till his early demise in 1971. And there are still so many conspiracy theories over his death. Even at death, his name still wouldn't die. A legacy that would live forever, even though it just might be for all the wrong reasons. The Kingsmen. We've had some controversial bands on here, but none that have been able to get the attention of the FBI. Well, not until now. Not until the Kingsmen. You might not remember them, but if you lived through the time, you'd remember Louie Louie, the group's hit song which held the number 2 spot on the Billboard charts for up to 6 weeks. The American rock band was formed in Portland, and was never the most popular. In total, the Kingsmen charted just 13 singles from 1963 to 1968. The only controversy they ever had was tied to Louie Louie, which, if you didn't know, was first performed by R&B singer Richard Berry. However, the Kingsmen version was the only one that got the world talking. The song was right at the center of an obscenity controversy due to its dirty lyrics. The song's vocals were so unintelligible that the FBI began investigating it. The investigation lasted over 3 months, but ultimately led to nothing. Besides that, the rights to Louie Louie were actually the subject of a lengthy ownership dispute between the group, their label, and the song's original author, Richard Berry. Outside of the song, the Kingsmen were pretty much on the low and would eventually vanish into thin air. Nevertheless, they'll forever be remembered as the group who even got the FBI spooked. The Rolling Stones. On our top spot is rock's original rebels. The one band you just knew would make it on here. A group that existed to be wild, the Rolling Stones. The Stones didn't just play rock and roll on stage or in the studios, they lived it. With swagger and a knack for ruffling feathers, the Stones became the bad boys of the 60s music scene. And no, their antics weren't just for show. While the Beatles charmed with mop tops, the Stones leaned into a grittier vibe, unkempt hair, leather jackets, and a blue sky sound that oozed rebellion. Critics called them corrupt and vulgar. Parents hated it. Teens, on the other hand, absolutely loved it. The question with the Stones isn't what they did, it's what they didn't do. The whole Jefferson Airplane fatal stabbing that we talked about earlier actually happened at a Rolling Stones concert. 2 years before that, police raided Keith Richards' home and ended up arresting him and Mick Jagger for drug possession. The headlines spelled bad news for the Stones. The fans, however, wanted them freed. Their 1968 song, Sympathy for the Devil, had religious groups accusing them of satanic worship. Spoiler alert, though, it wasn't. Other songs like Under My Thumb and Brown Sugar have aged like milk since their release back in the day, with the latter referencing slavery. The Stones were one of the bands that never shied away from the controversies. They wanted to be on the front page for all the wrong reasons. That was what rock and roll meant to them. Beneath that chaos was a thought-provoking social commentary, a sharp satire, and a legacy that made it all worth it. Sure, it's easy to look at these bands as troublemakers, but rather than that, they're pioneers and innovators. Regardless of the resistance of a different time, they fought to create true art. In the end, these aren't just controversies, it's their legacy, however shady they might seem. Did we miss any other bands? Tell us what you think in the comment section below.